Hey everyone, we have wrapped up World War II if you're in my class. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the aftermath of World War II and its effects, as well as the beginning of the Cold War. So by the time we're done, be able to identify what the Allied powers did after World War II to prevent future such calamities from actually happening again. You should be able to define what the Cold War is, a very basic working definition, and explain why the Cold War started, why these tensions developed between various countries after World War II. Also be able to define or identify the Nuremberg trials, the United Nations, the UN Security Council. UN stands for United Nations, by the way, couldn't figure that out, and also the Iron Curtain. So, once World War II ends, the Allied powers want to make sure that a future World War doesn't occur. They tried to do that after World War I with the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles, which, as you know, was a miserable failure. So, they try again with different types of measures to try to ensure world peace that will last. The first thing they did was punish the leaders of the Axis countries like Germany and Italy and Japan for what they had done during the war, for bringing this calamity on, and for committing horrible acts against their own people and people that they had conquered during the war. The most notable instance of that would be the Nuremberg trials, which were held starting in late 1945 and lasted about a year until late 1946, where 170 some odd Nazis and high-ranking German officials were put on trial for what the Allies called crimes against humanity, mostly relating to the Holocaust, but also for poor treatment of prisoners of war and civilians that had been murdered over the course of World War II in Europe. About 140 of them were found guilty, many of them sentenced to death, others sentenced to life in prison. This also happened in Italy and Japan, where the leaders of those countries were held accountable for what they had done during the war. Most notably in Japan, Hideki Kojo, the prime minister, was hanged for war crimes in the late 1940s. The Allied countries also occupied the countries that had been defeated. This didn't happen after World War I, so as a result, Germany was in absolute shambles, and that sort of allowed Hitler to come to power, which is obviously, not good. So the Allies decided to occupy Germany and Japan to help them set up a functioning government so that, these bad economic situations wouldn't happen again, these dictators with crazy ideas wouldn't come to power, and all of that. Now, the occupation of Germany and Japan are both going to cause some trouble between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that's the beginning of the Cold War, which we'll talk about here in a second. As you can see from the map, the four main victorious Allied countries divided Germany up into four separate zones. The green one is Great Britain, the blue one is France, the tannish khaki one is the United States, and the red one is the Soviet Union. They also divided up the German capital city of Berlin, which, even though it was in the Soviet zone, was divided up among those four countries as well. The same thing happened in Japan, although not on the Japanese mainland. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan 2 days after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and 1 day before the bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. So they were technically involved in the Pacific Theater. The Americans didn't want the Soviets occupying Japan after the war, so they gave them part of Korea, and that was what we now know today as North Korea. So remember this map of Germany because it's going to become very important later on. The final post-war measure that was taken to try to ensure world peace that we're going to talk about today was the creation of the United Nations, which happened in 1945. It was an organization of countries designed to mediate disputes and avoid war, very similar to the League of Nations that we talked about in the aftermath of World War I. But the difference in the United Nations, the big difference, is that the United States was a member, so it had a lot more clout. Every country that was a member of the United Nations had one vote in the General Assembly on any matter that came before it. But the most important part of the UN is the Security Council, which is a committee consisting of 15 countries. There are 5 countries that are permanent on that council, and those are the victorious countries from World War II, the U.S., France, Russia, or as it was back then, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and China. The other 10 members rotate from among the other membership. The United Nations primarily tries to mediate disputes between countries, like I said, but they also do things like combat world hunger and disease, especially in third world impoverished areas like Africa. So this takes us to the Cold War, which is a long-standing period of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. It started almost immediately after World War II, and it lasted until the early 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed. There was never an actual conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union that involved military strikes or fighting. We came very close a couple of times, most notably in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but there was never a direct fight between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. There were some Cold War inspired battles, you could say, or proxy battles of the Cold War between democratic countries and communist countries, like the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and we'll talk about those as the unit goes on. But most notably here, you just need to know what the Cold War is. It's that state of competition and tension between the West and the East, the West being the U.S., the East being the Soviets. So here are some of the basic causes of the Cold War. One is Soviet paranoia and fear over America getting the atomic bomb in 1945. The Soviets, especially Stalin, felt that the Americans having this horrible, very, very powerful weapon created an imbalance between the two countries, and the Soviets began to work to develop an atomic bomb on their own, which they eventually would do in 1949. Stalin also wanted to spread communism all throughout Europe. The Soviets were distrusted by the Americans and the British as a result of that. There were also disagreements over how to deal with the occupations of Germany and Japan, which I alluded to a few minutes ago. And also, Stalin did not allow Eastern European countries to have democratic elections. Now, you might be wondering, why does Stalin have a say in what Eastern Europe does? Well, at the end of World War II, when the Soviets were marching towards Berlin, they occupied the countries that they went through, countries like Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and then those countries were given communist-style governments. And the United States and Great Britain raised a huge stink about that, saying, you should allow them to elect their own leaders. You shouldn't impose communism on them. And Stalin said back to them, well, you didn't ask me how to occupy Japan or Italy or any of the other allied countries that were liberated from the Nazis, so stop telling me what to do. So you have this great deal of tension between both sides as a result of Stalin's actions. As I said, he installed communist governments in most of Eastern Europe. Those communist countries that were not the Soviet Union were known as satellite nations or satellite countries. Now, this does two things for Stalin. One, it spreads communism, which is what he wanted to do, but it also creates a buffer zone of sorts. It puts a bunch of countries between him in the Soviet Union and Germany, because Germany invaded Russia in World War I and World War II, and Stalin wanted to make sure that Germany, should they become powerful again in the future, wouldn't try it a third time. So as you can see in this map, you have this very well-defined division between the countries that were democratic and inspired by American and British style of governments, really, and the communist countries in the East that are noted in red there. Winston Churchill referred to this as an Iron Curtain in a speech that he gave in 1946. Now, it's not a literal fence or anything like that, but it is a very well-defined border between West and East. And in future videos in this unit, we're going to talk about how the Cold War manifested itself, how the communists continued to try to spread communism in other places throughout Europe and the world, and what the Western Europeans and the Americans did to try to stop that. As always, be ready for a quiz on this, and ask your teacher if you have any questions. Cheers!